Star Wars is a franchise that is littered with famous villains, but I think one of the antagonists who had the most potential was Count Dooku. And I know there's a lot of fans of this character, probably primarily due to the further fleshing out and screen time he receives in the Clone Wars, but I think as far as the movies go, not only was Count Dooku underutilized, but I think he was also misused a bit. Attack of the Clones initially presents Count Dooku as a third party in terms of the Sith versus Jedi conflict, as the Jedi don't believe he has fully fallen to the dark side, but rather that he left the Order because he thought the Jedi had a far too dogmatic view of the Force, and all things in general. And this is actually a really interesting idea, as the concept of balance is something that gets talked about a lot in Star Wars, but I don't think we really see it too often. To me, balance would be an equal ground between the dark and the light that uses aspects of both to combat the weaknesses of each side, as true balance shouldn't simply mean the absence of one of the two sides of the Force. But rather than having Count Dooku as this sort of middle ground / third party to this eternal conflict, he eventually gets revealed to just be a Sith apprentice, which I guess is fine, but it is a less interesting direction in my opinion. The idea of a fallen apprentice is something we had seen before, so the added twist that Dooku had not actually fallen, but instead was trying to forge a new way that walks the line between the dark and the light, could have been truly fascinating. You could still have him learning from Sidious, but rather than having near-blind loyalty to his master, it would have been interesting to see a bit of a chess match between the two, as Dooku could have been taking the teachings of Sidious to grow in strength, with the intention of betraying him in the end, when it was time to start his Grey Jedi Order, while Sidious could have been fully aware of this plan and could still simply be training Dooku just to use him as a tool to combat the Jedi from the sidelines. Now you may be thinking to yourself that Dooku kind of tried to do this in Attack of the Clones when he tried to lure Obi-Wan to the dark side, but I think we get confirmation that Lord Tyrannus was never truly going to betray Sidious in Episode 3, as he had a decent chunk of time post Anakin cutting his hands off to reveal that Palpatine was a Sith Lord, and the fact that he didn't do this, even as his master was telling someone to kill him, is undying loyalty if I've ever seen it. Now I know he tried to get Obi-Wan as his apprentice, and he eventually trains a few apprentices in the Clone Wars TV show, but I think all this proves is that Dooku simply wasn't a fan of the Rule of Two, as he likely wanted to make a Sith Order to replace the current Jedi Order, which unfortunately means that in my opinion, Count Dooku is as dogmatic as his Jedi counterparts, he just simply traded one side for another. If he were truly a third party in the conflict, I think his pitch to get Obi-Wan to join him suddenly becomes far more interesting, as he now is pitching something that Qui-Gon Jinn may have actually been in support of, as Qui-Gon was pretty frequently at odds with the Jedi Council, and even refused a spot on the Council because of their differing views of the Force. So presenting Obi-Wan with this potential temptation to leave the Order would make his story more engaging and intriguing, as it adds a new wrinkle to the fold, and it just would make Dooku stand out even more as a character / villain. I also think that an interesting direction that could have been taken with Count Dooku would have been to not have him leave the Jedi Order. I think he becomes far more interesting if he is still learning and training with the Jedi, Yoda specifically, while receiving Sidious training behind the scenes. He could still be doing this with the ultimate goal of forging his own path in the middle of both sides, but this could have led to a nice three-way conflict between Yoda, Sidious, and Dooku after Order 66. Rather than just having two sides battling, we could have had three, where the person in the middle was an apprentice to the strongest member of both sides, which could have added an even more interesting dynamic to the Yoda versus Sidious fight, as both would probably expect Dooku to help them in the fight, and Dooku would naturally be torn over which person to help more, or would just fight to kill both. While of course Dooku would have to be killed during this battle, as his existence past Episode 3 would conflict with the rest of the movies, just his presence alone makes this conflict more dynamic, and I think adds intrigue to a character who is largely absent of it, at least in the live-action movies that is. I also think featuring Dooku in this way opens the door for Darth Maul not to be killed in the first film, as he could serve as the outright evil figurehead of the Separatist forces, which would further allow Dooku to be in the middle somewhere in the gray area of everything. But I also just think Count Dooku should have been more heavily featured in the films. He gets name dropped in the opening crawl of Episode 2, only to not make an appearance until we're like an hour and a half into the film, which is bizarre because he was built up to be the main villain of Attack of the Clones. He also dies really early into Revenge of the Sith, so if we're excluding the Clone Wars television series, which does retroactively help fix a lot of the issues that the prequels have, Dooku is such a missed opportunity as he could have truly been a unique antagonist or anti-hero of sorts. All in all, I think Count Dooku is a fine enough character in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, but he ends up being a relatively minor footnote, all things considered, with the extreme lack of screen time, and I think he really had the potential to be far more of a standout character. I think the idea of him truly being in between the dark and light side of the Force, and even potentially training with Yoda and Sidious simultaneously, would have made for a really interesting dynamic that would present us with a fun alternative look on the dogmatic eternal conflict between the Sith and the Jedi. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video on a potential reworking of Count Dooku's character, please feel free to like or subscribe, and if you agree, disagree, or just have some strong Count Dooku thoughts, as always, I'd love to hear them in the comment section.